Audiobook presentation, Aristotle's Poetics. You're about to listen to a book written by the majestic philosopher Aristotle, the Poetics. This isn't just an ancient text, it is the foundational cornerstone of Western literary theory, a timeless map that explains how artistic perfection in narrative is built. Throughout these chapters, we have unveiled the art of imitation, mimesis, exploring the immutable rules for forging a masterpiece. You will discover why a story must have a perfect unity of action, with an inevitable beginning, middle, and end, and how genius resides in the balanced use of language, from the common word to the most sublime metaphor. We have analyzed the foundations of tragedy and the epic, dissecting their parts, plot, character, diction, to understand the mechanism that provokes the definitive emotional purification, catharsis. This audiobook is a direct encounter with the mind of a giant. It's true that listening to it may, at times, seem dense and complex as you are approaching the deepest analysis of creativity ever written. But in the end, the message is clear. Those who dare to navigate these philosophical waters and approach the thought of this great philosopher will not only understand the art of narration, but will also elevate the capacity of their own minds. Prepare for an intellectual journey that will transform the way you understand every story you read or hear. Chapter 1. Since our subject is poetics, we propose to discuss not only poetics itself, but also its species and their respective characteristics. We will explore the required plot for composing a beautiful poem, the number and nature of the constitutive parts of a poem, and also the remaining aspects that pertain to the same investigation. We must, therefore, follow the natural order and begin with the first facts. Epic poetry and tragic poetry, as well as comedy, the dithyramb, and, for the most part, the art of playing the flute and the cithara, are all imitations if considered in a general sense. But, at the same time, they differ from one another in three ways. This is either by the difference of class in their means, or in the objects, or in the manner of their imitations. The word imitation, mimesis in Greek, should be understood as the representation of reality. Just as color and form are used as means by those who, either through art or constant practice, imitate and draw diverse objects with their help, and as voice is employed by others. So too, in the mentioned group of arts, the means for them are, in general, language and harmony. These are employed either simply or in specific combinations. A combination of harmony and rhythm alone is the appropriate means in the art of playing the flute and the lyre, and other arts that correspond to the same description. For example, the imitative syrinx. Rhythm alone, without harmony, is the resource in the imitations of the dancer. For even the dancer, by the rhythm of their attitudes, can represent the characters of people, as well as what they do and suffer. Furthermore, there is an art that imitates only through language without harmony in prose or in verse. This can be in one or a plurality of meters. This form of imitation still lacks a common name today. We don't, in fact, have a common name for a mime by Sophron or by Xenarchus, and for a dialogue by Socrates. And certainly, we also lack a term if the imitation in both examples were in trimeters or elegiacs or another type of verse. It is true that people add the word poet to the name of a meter, and they speak of elegiac poets and epic poets. And they think they are called poets not because of the imitative nature of their work, but indiscriminately because of the meter in which they write. Even if a medical or physical philosophy theory were expressed in metrical form, it would be common to designate the author in this way. Homer and Empedocles, however, have no affinity between them. outside of the meter in which they express themselves. Thus, if one is called a poet, the other should be designated a physicist and not a poet. We would be in the same position, of course, if the imitation in these examples were in all meters, such as the Centaur by Chaeremon, and Chaeremon would have to be recognized as a poet. Enough, then, about these arts. In summary, there are some other arts that combine all the enumerated means: rhythm, melody, and verse. For example, dithyrambic and gnomic poetry, tragedy, and comedy. With the difference, however, that the three classes of means are all employed together in some of them, and in others they appear separately, one after another. Such are the differences that I establish between the arts regarding the means of achieving imitation. Chapter 2. The objects that imitators represent are actions, affected by agents who are good or bad. The diversities of human character almost always derive from this distinction, for the line between virtue and vice is what divides all humanity, and they imitate them better or worse than we are, or similar to us, just as painters proceed. For example, Polygnotus represented his characters as superior to us, Pauson as worse, and those of Dionysius were such as we are. It is clear that each of the types of imitation to which I have referred will admit these variations, and they will then differ according to the differences in the objects they represent. Even in dance, the art of playing the flute and the lyre, such diversities are possible, and they also occur in the unnamed parts that use language, prose, or verse without harmony as their means. Homer's characters, for example, are better than us. Those of Cleophon are at our level, and those of Hegemon of Thasos, the first author of Parodies, and Nicochares, who wrote the Diliad, are below this model. The same is true of the dithyramb and the nomos. The characters can be represented in them with the difference exemplified in the Cyclopes of Timotheus and Philoxenus. This difference is also what distinguishes tragedy and comedy. The latter paints people worse than they are, while the former paints them better than those of the present. Chapter 3. A third difference in these arts lies in the manner in which each type of object is represented. If both parts are given the same medium and the same kind of objects for imitation, one can narrate directly in one moment and assume another character in another, as Homer does. Or one can always remain the same without any change. Alternatively, the imitators may represent the entire story dramatically, as if the described facts were truly being performed. However, as we said at the beginning, the differences in the imitation of these arts appear in three forms: their means, their objects, and their manners. Therefore, as an imitator, Sophocles, on the one hand, resembles Homer, as both represent superior men, and on the other hand, he resembles Aristophanes, since all of them exhibit people who are acting and performing something. This, indeed, some say, is the reason why their works are called dramas, because in them the characters act out the plot. Hence, both tragedy and comedy are claimed by the Dorians as their discoveries. Comedy is claimed by the Megarians, those who emerged in Greece when Megara became a democracy, and by the Megarians of Sicily, because the poet Epicharmus came from their country and lived long before Chionides and Magnus. Tragedy is also claimed by some Dorians of the Peloponnese. In support of these claims, they refer to the words comedy and drama. Their word for the surrounding villages, they say, is Kome, whereas the Athenians call theirs Demes. They thus suppose that comedians derived their name not from their como, or revels, but from their wandering from village to village, lacking appreciation, and compelled to roam outside the city. They also affirm that their word for to act is dran, while the Athenians use the verb pratin. This is enough, then, regarding the number and nature of the points of difference in the imitation of these arts. Chapter 4. It is evident that the general origin of poetry was due to two causes. Each of these stems from human nature. First, imitation is natural to man from childhood. This is one of his advantages over the lower animals, for he is one of the most imitative creatures in the world, and learns from the start by imitation. Second, it is also natural for everyone to rejoice in tasks of imitation. The truth of this second point is shown by experience. Although the objects themselves may be painful to see, we delight in contemplating the most realistic representations of them in art. The forms, for example, of the most repulsive animals and dead bodies. The explanation lies in a concrete fact. Learning something is the greatest of pleasures. This is true not only for the philosopher but also for the rest of humanity, no matter how small their aptitude for it. The reason for the delight produced by observing a picture is that at the same time one learns, one grasps the meaning of things, that the man is of this or that kind. For if we had not seen the object before, the pleasure itself would not lie in the picture as an imitation of it, but would be due to the execution, or the coloring, or some similar cause. Imitation, then, being natural to us, as is also the sense of harmony and rhythm, meters are indeed species of rhythms. People, through their original aptitude, and through a series of gradual improvements, created poetry from their improvisations. Poetry, however, soon divided into two classes according to the differences in character among the individual poets. For the most elevated among them aimed to represent the noblest actions and the most excellent characters, while those of inferior spirit represented vile actions. The latter first produced invectives, just as others composed hymns and panegyrics. We know of no poem by pre-Homeric poets, although there were undoubtedly many authors among them. Examples can certainly be found from Homer onward, such as his Margites and similar poems by others. In this poetry of invective, its natural fitness brought the iambic meter into use. Hence our present term, iambic, because it was the meter of their iambos, or invectives against one another. The result was that the old poets became, some of them, authors of heroic verse, and others of iambic. Homer's position, however, is peculiar, just as he was the poet of poets in the serious style, elevated not only by his literary excellence but also by the dramatic character of his imitations. He was likewise the first to sketch for us the general forms of comedy by producing not a dramatic invective, but a dramatic picture of the ridiculous. His Margites indeed stands in the same relation to our comedies as the Iliad and the Odyssey stand to our tragedies. But as soon as tragedy and comedy appeared on the scene, those naturally attracted to a certain line of poetry became authors of comedies instead of iambs, and the others, inclined by their nature to a distinct line, became creators of tragedies instead of epics, because these new modes of art were more majestic and held in higher esteem than the ancient ones. As for questioning whether tragedy is now everything it ought to be in its formative elements, considering all that, and deciding it theoretically and in relation to the performances, that is a problem for another investigation. Tragedy certainly began through improvisations, as did comedy. The former originated with the authors of the dithyrambs, the latter with the phallic songs, which still survive as institutions in some of our cities. And its advance since then was slow, through its transformation and then after overcoming stages at each step. Only after a long series of changes did the movement of tragedy stop upon reaching its natural form. First, the number of actors was increased to 2 by Aeschylus, who decreased the importance of the chorus and made the dialogue, or the spoken part, assume the decisive mission in the drama. Second, a third actor and scene painting were due to Sophocles. Third, tragedy also acquired its magnificence. It discarded the short stories and the vulgar language, which it owed to its satirical origin, and achieved, though only at a late moment in its progress, a tone of dignity. Its meter changed, for the trochaic gave way to the iambic. The reason for its original use of the trochaic tetrameter lay in the fact that its poetry was satirical and more connected with dance than is the case now. However, as soon as the spoken part was introduced, nature itself found the appropriate meter. The iambic, as we know, is the most flexible of the meters, as is shown by the fact that we very often fall into it in dialogue, while it is rare for us to speak in hexameters, and this only when we separate ourselves from the spoken tone of the voice. Fourth, another change was the plurality of episodes or acts. As for the remaining problems, the superadded embellishments and the account of their introduction, these must be accepted as stated, for it would demand a very long task to review the details. Chapter 5. Regarding comedy, it is, as has been observed, an imitation of people worse than they are. Worse, indeed, not in respect to every kind of fault, but only concerning a particular class. The ridiculous, which is a species of the ugly. The ridiculous may perhaps be defined as an error or deformity that produces neither pain nor harm to others. The mask, for example, which provokes laughter, is something ugly and distorted, yet causes no pain. Although the successive changes in tragedy and its authors are not unknown, we cannot say the same for comedy. Its earliest stages passed unnoticed because it had not yet been taken seriously. This happened only at a later point in its progress when a chorus of comedians was officially recognized by the archon. They used to be simple volunteers. Comedy had already reached certain defined forms when the memory of those individuals called comic poets began, who provided it with masks or prologues or a plurality of actors and other elements is unknown. The prepared fable or plot certainly originated in Sicily, with Epicharmus and Formus. Of the Athenian poets, Crates was the first to eliminate invective from comedy and created arguments of a general and not personal nature, that is, studied fables or arguments. The epic thus coincides with tragedy in this context. Both are an imitation of serious subjects in a high-flown verse. It differs from tragedy, however, in several points. 1. It is expressed in one kind of verse and in narrative form. 2. In its length, which is due to its action having no fixed limit in time, while tragedy strives to keep itself, as much as possible, within one complete revolution of the sun, or close to this measure. This, I insist, is another point of difference between them, although at first the practice in this respect was exactly the same in both tragedies and epics. 3. They also differ in their constituent elements, for some are common to both and others are peculiar to tragedy. Hence, a judge of a good or bad tragedy is likewise a judge of the epic. All the parts of an epic are included in tragedy, but those of the tragedy are not all found in the epic. Chapter 6. While we reserve for later consideration poetry and comedy in hexameters, we will now proceed with the discussion of tragedy. Before doing so, however, we must summarize the resulting definition from what has been said. A tragedy, consequently, is the imitation of an action that is elevated and, having magnitude, is complete in itself. It is enriched in language, with artistic embellishments appropriate to the various parts of the work. It is presented in dramatic form, not as a narration, but with incidents that excite pity and fear, by means of which they bring about the catharsis of such emotions. Here, by language enriched with artistic embellishments, I mean with rhythm, harmony, and music added, and by appropriate to the various parts, I signify that some of them are produced only by means of the verse, and others in turn with the help of the songs. Now, since people represent actions, it follows in the first place that the spectacle, or the appearance of the actors on the stage must be part of the whole. And secondly, the melody and the diction. These two are the means of its imitation. Here, by diction, I mean only this, the composition of the verses, and by melody, what is understood without effort to require explanation. But there is more. The subject represented is also an action, and the action requires actors who must necessarily have their distinguishing qualities in both character and thought. Since it is from these facts that we assign certain qualities to their actions. Consequently, in the general order of things, there are two causes, the thought and the character of their actions, and therefore of their success or failure in their lives. Thus, the action, what was done, is represented in the drama by the fable, or the plot. The fable, in our present sense of the term, is simply this, the combination of the incidents or events that occurred in the story, whereas the character is what moves us to ascribe certain moral qualities to the protagonists, and thought is discerned in everything they say when they prove a particular point or perhaps state a general truth. There are, then, indeed, 6 parts in every tragedy taken together, that is, of one quality or another, the fable or plot, the characters, the diction or elocution, the thought, the spectacle, and the melody. 2 of these arise from the means, 1 from the manner, and 3 from the objects of dramatic imitation. And there is nothing more apart from these 6. Of these formative elements, almost all playwrights have made due use, since every drama, it can be affirmed, admits the spectacle, the protagonist, the fable, the diction, the melody, and the thought. The most important of the 6 is the combination of the incidents of the fable. Tragedy is essentially an imitation not of people, but of action and life, of happiness and unhappiness. All human happiness or unhappiness takes the form of action. The end for which we live is a kind of activity, not a quality. The protagonist gives us qualities, but it is in our actions, what we do, where we are happy or the opposite. In a drama, then, the characters do not act to represent the characters. They include the characters for the sake of the action. Thus, it is the action in it, that is, its fable or plot, that constitutes the end or purpose of tragedy, and the end is everywhere the principal thing. Apart from this, a tragedy is impossible without action, although there can be one without character. The tragedies of most current authors lack character, a common defect among poets of all kinds, and one with its counterpart in painting, as in the case of Zeuxis compared to Polygnotus. For while the latter is strong in character, the work of Zeuxis lacks it. And moreover, one may put together a series of characteristic speeches of the finest expression regarding diction and thought, and yet easily fail to produce the true tragic effect. However, one will have much greater success with a tragedy that, however inferior in these aspects, possesses within it a well-constructed plot and a combination of incidents. And it should be added, the most powerful elements of attraction in tragedy, the peripetia and the recognitions, are parts of the fable. A more conclusive proof lies in the fact that beginners succeed much earlier with diction and characters than with the construction of the plot, and the same can be affirmed of almost all earlier playwrights. We maintain, consequently, that the first and essential, the life and soul, so to speak, of tragedy is the fable, and that the characters appear in second place. Indeed, consider the parallel with painting, where the most beautiful colors placed without order will not give us the same pleasure as the simple black and white sketch of a portrait. We underscore that tragedy is above all an imitation of action, and that it is above all through the action that it imitates the acting agents. In third place appears the element of thought. This is the power of expressing what should be said, or what is appropriate for the occasion. This is what in the speeches of tragedy falls within the art of politics and rhetoric. For the old poets make their characters speak like statesmen, and the moderns like rhetoricians. This should not be confused with character. Character in a drama is what reveals the moral purpose of the protagonists. That is, the kind of deed they intend to avoid, where the case is not clear. Hence, there is no place for character in a speech on a subject completely indifferent. Thought, moreover, is proven in everything the characters say when they accept or reject some particular aspect or state some universal proposition. Fourth among the literary elements is the diction of the characters, which, as explained before, is the expression of their thoughts in words, which is practically the same in verse as in prose. Regarding the two remaining parts, melody is the highest of the adornments of tragedy. The spectacle, although an attraction, is the least artistic of all the parts, and has little relation to the art of poetry. The tragic effect is entirely possible without a public function and without actors. And besides, the staging of the spectacle is more a problem of scenographic technique than of the poets. Chapter 7. Having distinguished the parts, we will now consider the proper construction of the fable or plot, inasmuch as this is undoubtedly the first and most important element in tragedy. We have established that a tragedy is an imitation of an action that is complete in itself, as a whole of a certain magnitude, for a whole may lack the magnitude to speak of it. Now, a whole is that which possesses a beginning, a middle, and an end. A beginning is that which necessarily does not happen after something else, although something else exists or happens after it. The end, on the contrary, is that which naturally follows from something else, either as a necessary or usual consequence, and is not followed by anything else. A well-constructed plot, consequently, cannot just begin or end at the desired point. The beginning and the end in this must be of the forms just described. Thus, to be beautiful, a living creature and every whole composed of parts must not only present a certain order in the arrangement of its parts, but also possess a certain definite magnitude. Beauty is a problem of size and order, and is therefore impossible. 1. In an insignificant creature, since our perception becomes indistinct when it approaches instantaneously. Or 2. In a creature of great size, say, 1,000 stadia long, since in such a case, instead of seeing the object at once, its unity and wholeness are lost to the observer. In the same way, then, just as a beautiful whole made of parts, or a beautiful living creature must be of a determined size, but of a size apprehensible by the eye, similarly, a plot or argument must possess a certain extension, yet be capable of being grasped by the memory. Regarding the limit of the extension, as far as it concerns public functions and spectators, this does not fall within the theory of poetry. If one had to represent 100 tragedies, these would be measured by the water clock, as has happened at some time. The limit, however, established by the current state of things is this: the more extensive the fable is, provided it remains coherent and comprehensible as a whole, the more beautiful it will be by reason of its magnitude. According to a general common formula, an extension that allows the hero to pass through a series of probable or necessary stages from misfortune to happiness, or from happiness to misfortune, may suffice as a limit for the representation of the plot. Chapter 8. The unity of the fable does not consist, as some suppose, in having one person as a hero. For the life of a single person comprises a great number, indeed an infinity, of events that do not form a unity. And likewise, there are many actions of an individual that cannot be joined to form one single action. Therefore, the error of all the poets who have written a Heraclid, a Theseid, or similar poems is evident. They believe that because Heracles was one man, the story of Heracles must be one story. Homer, without a doubt, understood this aspect very well, either by art or by instinct, precisely because he excelled the rest in all details. In writing the Odyssey, he did not allow the poem to record everything that certainly happened to the hero. For example, it happened to him that he was wounded on Parnassus, and also that he feigned madness at the time of the call to arms, but both incidents had no necessary or probable connection with each other. Instead, he took as the subject of the Odyssey, as well as the Iliad, an action with the unity of the type we have described. The truth is that, just as in the other imitative arts, an imitation is always of one thing, in the same way in poetry, the fable, as an imitation of action, must represent one action, a complete whole. This whole must have its various incidents so intimately related that the transposition or elimination of any one of them distorts or dislocates the whole. For this reason, that which by its presence or absence causes no perceptible difference forms no real part of the whole. Chapter 9. From what we have said, it is clear that the poet's task is to describe not what has happened, but what might have occurred. That is, both what is possible and what is probable or necessary. The distinction between the historian and the poet does not consist in one writing in prose and the other in verse. One could transfer the work of Herodotus to verse, and it would still remain a kind of history. The difference lies in the fact that one relates what has happened, and the other relates what could have happened. Hence, poetry is more philosophical and of greater dignity than history, since its statements are rather of the universal kind, while those of history are particular. By universal propositions we must understand the kind of statements and acts that a certain type of person will say or do in a given situation, and such is the end of poetry, even though it assigns proper names to the characters. Particular facts are, let's say, what Alcibiades did, or what happened to him. In comedy, this is already clear, for the comic poets constructed their fables from probable events, and then added some names according to their whim. They did not write, like the iambic poets, about particular individuals. In tragedy, however, they still adhered to historical names, and for this reason, what convinces is what is possible. While we cannot be sure of the possibility of something that has not happened, what has happened is of course possible, since it would not have happened if it had not been so. However, even in tragedy there are some dramas with only one or two known names in them. The rest is invention. And there are some without any known name, for example, Agathon's Antheus, in which both the incidents and the names are the poet's creations, and the drama is no less delightful for it. Thus, it seems that we should not adhere rigidly to the traditional stories on which tragedies are based. It would be absurd to proceed in this manner indeed, even though the known stories are known only to a few, although they are a delight to all. According to what was said before, it is clear that the poet must be more the author of their fables or plots than of their verses. Above all because they are a poet by virtue of the imitative element of their work, and it is actions that they imitate. And if they adopt a theme from real history, they are no less a poet for it, since some historical events may very well be in the probable and possible order of things, and in that sense, by those facts, they become its poet. Of simple fables and actions, the episodic is the worst. I call a fable episodic when there is neither probability nor necessity in the sequence of the episodes. Fables of this kind are constructed by bad poets because of their inability, and by good poets due to the actors. By performing their work for public functions, a good poet often strains a fable beyond its capabilities, and is thus forced to distort the sequences of its incidents. Tragedy, consequently, is an imitation not only of a complete action, but also of incidents that provoke pity and fear. Such incidents have the maximum effect on the mind when they occur unexpectedly and at the same time follow one another. Then they are more marvelous than if they happened by themselves or by simple chance. Indeed, even occasional facts seem more astonishing when they have the semblance of having been done by design. Thus, for example, the statue of Mimesis in Argos killed the man who had caused his death by falling on him at a ceremony. Facts of this type do not seem like chance occurrences. That is why fables of that kind are necessarily better than the others. Chapter 10 fables are either simple or complex, since the actions they represent naturally obey this dual description. I call an action simple, which proceeds in the defined form as a continuous whole, when the change in the hero's fortune occurs without peripeteia or recognition. I call an action complex when it involves one or the other of these occurrences, or both. These actions must arise from the structure of the fable itself, so that they are the necessary or probable consequence of the preceding events. There is a great difference between something that happens because of this and something that happens after this. Chapter 11, as has been observed. Peripeteia is a change from one state of things to its opposite, which, as I said, accords with the probability or necessity of the events. For example, in Oedipus. Here the change is brought about by the messenger who, aiming to cheer Oedipus and remove his fears regarding his mother, reveals the secret of his birth. And in Lynceus, just when he is being led out for execution, with Danos by his side, ready to enforce the sentence, the incidents preceding the event are modified to the point that the former is saved and Danos is executed. Recognition is, as the very word indicates, a change from ignorance to knowledge, and thus leads to love or hatred in the characters marked by good or ill fortune. The most refined form of recognition is that which is achieved through peripeteia, like those that occur in Oedipus. There are, of course, other forms. What we have said can happen in a certain way with reference to inanimate objects, even things of a chance nature. And recognition is also possible if someone has or has not done something. But the form most directly related to the fable and the action of the drama is the one mentioned first. This, together with the peripeteia, will arouse either pity or fear, which are the actions that tragedy is prepared to represent, and which will also serve to bring about the happy or unhappy end. Recognition, in such a case, since it involves people, may be only that of one party to the other, for the second is already known, or both parties may have to discover each other. Iphigenia, for example, was discovered by Orestes through the sending of the letter, and another recognition was required for Iphigenia to recognize him. Two parts of the fable, then the peripeteia and the recognition, represent such incidents as these. A third part is suffering, which we may define as an action of a destructive or pathetic nature, such as murders on the stage, tortures, wounds, and so forth. The other two have already been explained. Chapter 12. The parts of tragedy that are to be treated as formative elements of the whole were mentioned in a previous chapter. However, from the perspective of their quantity, that is, the separate sections into which it is divided, a tragedy possesses the following parts. Prologue, episode, exodos, and a choral song, which is divided into the parodos and the stasimon. These two are common to all tragedies, while the songs of the scene and the komoi are found only in some. The prologue is everything that precedes the parodos of the chorus. An episode is everything that comes between two complete choral songs. The exodos is everything that follows after the last choral song. In the choral sections, the parodos is the first complete utterance of the chorus. A stasimon is a choral song without anapaests or trochees. A komos is a passage of lamentation in which both the chorus and the actors take part. We have already mentioned the parts of tragedy used together as formative elements. The previously cited are its parts from the point of view of its quantity, or the separate sections into which it is divided. Chapter 13. The next points, following what we have already discussed, are these. What should the poet aim for, and what should they avoid when constructing their fables? And what are the conditions on which the tragic effect depends? We understand that for the most beautiful form of tragedy, the fable must not be simple, but complex. Furthermore, it must imitate actions that provoke fear and pity, since this is the distinctive function of this class of imitation. Consequently, it follows that there are three forms of fables that must be avoided. 1. An excellent man should not appear passing from happiness to misfortune. This situation is neither pitiful nor fear-inspiring. It is simply hateful to us. 2. A bad man should not pass from misfortune to happiness. This is the least tragic situation that can be presented. It lacks all the requirements of tragedy. It appeals neither to the human feelings in us nor to our pity nor our fear. 3. A man who is extremely wicked must not slide from happiness to misery. Such a story may arouse a general sense of justice in us, though it will lead us neither to pity nor to fear. Pity is occasioned by undeserved misfortune, and fear by something that happens to men similar to ourselves. Therefore, there would be nothing pitiful or fear-inspiring in the situation. There remains, then, an intermediate class of character, a man who is not extremely virtuous nor just, whose misfortune has befallen him not because of vice or depravity, but because of some error of judgment. This is the case with those who enjoy great reputation and prosperity, for example, Oedipus, Thyestes, and the prestigious men in illustrious families. The perfect fable, therefore, must possess a simple interest, not a double one, as some suggest. The change in the hero's fortune must not be from misery to happiness, but on the contrary, from happiness to misfortune. The cause of this transformation must not lie in any depravity, but in some great error on his part, and the man himself must be such as we have described, or better, not worse than that example. The facts also confirm our theory. Although poets began by accepting any tragic story that came to mind, the most beautiful tragedies these days are always those about a few illustrious houses, such as those of Alcmaeon, Oedipus, Orestes, Meleager, Thyestes, Telephus, or some others who may have been involved, either as characters or victims, in certain horrible events. Theoretically, then, the best tragedy possesses a plot of this description. However, critics are wrong when they accuse Euripides of adopting this line in his tragedies and giving many of them an unhappy ending. This is, as we have stated, the correct tendency to follow. The best proof is this. On the stage and in public competitions, such dramas, carefully executed, are seen as the most truly tragic. And Euripides, although his execution may fail in other aspects, is nevertheless considered the best of the tragic playwrights. Following these considerations, we must speak of the construction of the fable that some place first, the one that can have a double story, like the Odyssey, and an opposite outcome for the good and bad characters. This is considered the best only because of the poor taste of the audience. Poets simply follow their public and write according to their dictates. But here, the pleasure is not the one provoked by tragedy. It belongs rather to comedy, where the most bitter enemies in the piece, for example, Orestes and Aegisthus, finally become good friends, and no one kills anyone. Chapter 14. Tragic fear and pity can be provoked by the spectacle, but they can also arise from the very structure and incidents of the drama, which is the best way and shows the best poet. The fable must, therefore, be so well ordered that even without seeing what happens, Whoever only hears the story should feel filled with horror and pity at the incidents. This is, indeed, the effect that the simple recitation of the story of Oedipus produces on the listener. To provoke this same effect by means of the spectacle is less artistic and requires scenographic help. However, those who use the spectacle to place before us what is simply monstrous and does not produce fear are completely ignorant of the meaning of tragedy. One should not demand every kind of pleasure from tragedy, but only its own distinctive pleasure. The tragic pleasure is that of pity and fear, and the poet must produce it through a task of imitation. It is clear, consequently, that the causes must be included in the incidents of the story. Let us then look at what kind of incidents move us as horrible, rather than as pitiful. In an event of this type, the parties must necessarily be either friends, enemies, or indifferent to each other. Now, when an enemy attacks their enemy, there is nothing in it that moves us to pity in the act or in its contemplation, except insofar as it concerns the actual pain of the sufferer. The same is true when the parties are indifferent. However, when the tragic act occurs within the family, that is, when the murder or harm is premeditated by the brother against the brother, by the son against the father, by the mother against the son, or the son against the mother, such are the situations the poet must seek. Traditional stories must be preserved as they are, for example, the murder of Clytemnestra by Orestes and of Euryphile by Alcmaeon. At the same time, even within these events, something remains for the poet themselves. They must devise the correct way to treat the facts. Let us explain more clearly what we mean by the correct way. The horrible deed can be performed by the agent with knowledge and consciousness, as in the old poets and the murder of the children by Medea in Euripides. Or they can do it but with ignorance of the relationship and discover it afterward, as happens to Oedipus and Sophocles. Here the deed is outside the drama, but it can remain within it, like the act of Alcmaeon in Astydamas or that of Telegonus in Odysseus Wounded. A third possibility is that of the person who meditates a mortal injury against another in ignorance of the relationship, but who achieves recognition to stop in time. What has been said exhausts the possibilities, since the deed must necessarily be performed or avoided knowingly or unknowingly. The worst situation occurs when the character is about to commit the deed with full knowledge and desists from it. This is unsettling and also not tragic, due to the absence of suffering. Hence, no one acts in such a way, except in a few cases, for example, Haemon and Creon in Antigone. After this comes the actual perpetration of the contemplated event. A better situation than this, however, is that the deed is committed with ignorance, and the relationship is discovered afterward, since there is nothing unpleasant in it, and the recognition must serve to astonish us. But the best of all is the last one. It is what we have in Cresphontus, for example, when Merope, about to kill her son, recognizes him in time. In Iphigenia, when the sister and brother find themselves in a similar situation, and in Hella, at the instant when the son recognizes his mother when he is about to hand her over to the enemy. This will explain why our tragedies are restricted to such a small number of families. It was accident, rather than art, that led the poets to the search for themes to frame this kind of incident in their fables. They are still obliged to resort, then, to the families in which these misfortunes occurred. Regarding the construction of the fable and the kind of fable required, enough has already been said. Chapter 15. Regarding the characters, there are 4 points that must be mentioned. First, and above all, they must be good. There will be character in a drama if, as has been observed, what the person says or does reveals a certain moral purpose, and a good character if the purpose thus revealed is good. There can be goodness in all sorts of people, even in a woman or a slave, although the former is perhaps inferior and the latter a being totally without value. Second is propriety or suitability. The character before us must be, let us say, manly. But it is not appropriate for a woman's character to be manly or clever. Third is that the character be true to life or lifelike, which is not the same as being good or appropriate in our sense of the term. Fourth, the character must be consistent and the same throughout. Even if inconsistency were part of the person before us for imitation and presented that form of character, they must be painted as coherently inconsistent. We have an example of unnecessary baseness of character in Menelaus and Orestes, of incongruity and unsuitability in the lamentation of Odysseus in Scylla, and in the clever speech of Melanippe, and of inconsistency in Iphigenia at Aulis, for Iphigenia, as a suppliant, is completely different from what she will be later. The correct thing to do, therefore, in the characters as well as in the incidents of the drama, is to always seek the necessary or the probable. This is so that when such a character says or does such a thing, it is the necessary or probable consequence of their character. From this, it is clear that the denouement must also arise from the fable itself, and not depend on a stage device, as in Medea, or in the episode of the Greek fleet being detained in the Iliad. The device, deus ex machina, must be reserved for problems outside the drama, for past events beyond human knowledge, or events yet to occur, which require to be foreseen or announced, since it is the privilege of the gods to know beforehand. Among the real incidents, nothing should be inexplicable, and if it were, it must be excluded from the tragedy, as in Sophocles' Oedipus. But let us return to the characters. As tragedy is an imitation of people better than the average, we must follow the example of good portrait painters. They reproduce a person's distinctive features and, at the same time, without losing the likeness, paint them better than they are. In the same way, the poet, in representing people who are quick or slow to anger, or with a similar weakness of character, must know how to portray them as such, and at the same time as excellent people, just as Agathon and Homer have represented Achilles. All these rules must always be kept in mind, as must those intended for the effects on the stage, which depend directly on the poet's art, since errors can often be made in these as well. However, we have already said enough on the subject in our published writings. Chapter 16. Recognition in general has already been explained. As for the classes of recognition, the first is noted for being the least artistic, which poets use heavily due to lack of invention. This is discovery by signs or tokens. Of these signs, some are congenital, like the spear that the children of the earth carry on them, or the star, such as the one Carcinus displays in his Thyestes. Other signs are acquired after birth. These acquired signs are either marks on the body, for example, scars or external tokens like necklaces or, to cite another example, the ark in the recognition scene of the drama Tyro. These signs, however, allow for two uses, one better and one worse. The scar of Odysseus is an example. His recognition through the sign is done in one way by the nurse and in another by the swineherds. A recognition that employs signs merely as a means of certainty is less artistic, for indeed are all those that appeal to reflection, whereas those that produce a sudden recognition, like the bathing scene, are better. Apart from these, we have discoveries made directly by the poet, which are inartistic for that very reason. Thus, in Iphigenia, the recognition of Orestes by himself, while his sister reveals who he is by a letter. Orestes says what the poet wants, rather than what the fable demands. This, consequently, is not far from the fault mentioned before, since Orestes could have also presented some token, Another example is the voice of the shuttle in Sophocles' Tereus. A third kind is recognition through memory, which awakens a person's consciousness by something seen. Thus, in the drama The Cyprians by Dicyogenes, the sight of the picture leads the man to burst into tears. And in the apologue of Alcinous, Odysseus, upon hearing the Cythera, remembers the past and also weeps. A fourth kind of recognition occurs through reasoning. For example, in The Libation Bearers, someone who looks like me is here. There is no one else like me except Orestes. Therefore, he must be here. Another example is the one the sophist Politis suggests for Iphigenia. It is probable that if her sister was sacrificed, her fate must be the same. Or the episode of Theodectes Tydeus, I came to seek a son, and I myself must die. Or also in the Finidae, upon seeing the place, the woman inferred their fate, that they would die there, since it was the place where they had been exposed at birth. There is also an incorrect recognition that arises from erroneous reasoning on the part of the audience. An example of this is seen in Odysseus, the false messenger. He claims he would recognize the bow, which he hasn't seen, the best of all recognitions, however, is that which arises from the incidents themselves, when the great surprise appears through a probable fact, as is the case in Sophocles' Oedipus and also in Iphigenia, since it is very probable that she would want to send a letter home. These last are the only recognitions independent of the artifice of signs and necklaces. The best after these are the recognitions that depend on reasoning. Chapter 17. At the moment of constructing their fables and determining the elocution in which they are to be framed, the poet must remember to have the actual scenes before their eyes as much as possible. By observing everything with such vividness as if they were an eyewitness, the poet can create what is suitable and will be less likely to overlook inconsistencies. This shows why Carcinus was censured for making Amphiaraus come out of the temple. The event would have gone unnoticed if it hadn't been observed by the audience. In the scene, the drama failed, for the incongruity of the incident offended the spectators. As far as possible, the poet must also act out their story with the very gestures of their characters. Given the same natural conditions, the one who feels the emotions that must be described will be the most convincing. Pain and fear, for example, are painted with greater force by the one who experiences them at that moment. Hence, such poetry demands a person with a special aptitude for it, or someone who is touched by madness. The former can easily assume the appropriate state of mind, and the latter may actually be possessed by poetic frenzy. The poet's fable, whether already prepared or of their own invention, must first be simplified and reduced to a universal form before proceeding to expand it by the insertion of episodes. The following will show how the universal element in Iphigenia, for example, can be considered. A certain maiden, offered in sacrifice, and mysteriously disappeared from the sight of the sacrificers, is transported to another land, where the custom was to immolate all foreigners before the deity. She is then made the priestess of this rite. Much later, the priestess's brother manages to reach the place. It happens, however, that the oracle, for certain reasons, has urged him to go there, and the purpose of his journey is outside the drama's fable. Upon arrival, he was arrested and was about to be sacrificed until he reveals his identity, either as Euripides tells it or as Politis suggests, by the natural exclamation, "Thus I, too, I'm condemned to be sacrificed as my sister was." This confession saves him. Once this stage is complete, after having fixed the proper names as the basis of the fable, it is necessary to interweave the episodes or accessory incidents. The episodes must, of course, be suitable, like Orestes' attack of madness, which caused his arrest, and the purification that determined his salvation. In dramas, the episodes are short. In the epic, they serve to extend the poem. The argument of the Odyssey is not long. A man is away from his home for many years. Poseidon watches him carefully, but he is completely alone. At home, things have reached the extreme that his wealth has been squandered, and the death of his son is plotted by his wife's suitors. After many adventures and sufferings, he manages to return. He reveals himself and falls upon his enemies, and the end is his salvation and their destruction. This is what is appropriate in the Odyssey. Everything else in it is episodic. Chapter 18. There is, furthermore, another point that must be kept in mind. Every tragedy is in part complication and in part denouement. The incidents before the initial scene, and often some of those within the drama, form the complication, and the rest is the denouement. By complication, I mean everything from the beginning of the fable up to the instant, just before the change in the hero's fortune. By denouement, I mean everything from the beginning of the change until the end. In Theodectes Lynceus, for example, the complication includes, along with the supposed incidents, the abduction of the child, and in turn that of the parents. The denouement is everything from the trial of the killer until the end. Now, properly speaking, tragedies should be classified as similar or different according to their fables. That is, according to their resemblance in the complication and the denouement. However, there are playwrights who, after a good complication, fail in the denouement. What is required is a complete mastery of both techniques. There are 4 distinct classes of tragedy, which is the number of the constitutive parts I have already mentioned. First, the complex tragedy, where everything is peripeteia and recognition. Second, the pathetic tragedy, for example, the various dramas about Ajax and Ixion. Third, the tragedy of character, such as the Pthiotides and Peleus. Fourth, the spectacular tragedy, exemplified by the Phorcides, Prometheus, and all the dramas set in Hades. The poet's design must consequently be to combine every element of interest, if possible, or at least the most important and the greater part of them. This is now especially necessary due to the unjust criticism to which the poet is subjected in our day. Precisely because there have been poets of great spirit in diverse species of tragedies before him, critics now expect one person to surpass what was the strong point of each of their predecessors. It should also be remembered what has been said more than once. Do not write a tragedy with an epic structure. That is, with a plurality of fables in it, and attempting to dramatize, for example, the entire story of the Iliad. In the epic, due to its length, each part is treated according to its own length. In the drama, however, on the same story, the result is very disappointing. This is understood by the fact that anyone who has dramatized the fall of Troy in its entirety, and not part by part, like Euripides or the whole story of Niobe, instead of a fragment like Aeschylus, has either failed completely or achieved very poor success on the stage. And for this and nothing more than this, a drama by Agathon was condemned to ruin. Nevertheless, in their peripeteia, as well as in their simple fables, these poets show magnificent talent in aiming at the kind of effect they desire. That is, something that is tragic and arouses human feeling in us, like the clever villain, Sisyphus, for example, being deceived, and the brave evildoer being overcome. This is probable, however, in Agathon's sense when he speaks of the probability of the improbabilities that often occur. The chorus must also be considered as one of the actors. It must be an integral part of the whole, and participate in the action, which happens more in Sophocles than in Euripides. With later poets, indeed, the songs in their dramas have no more relation to the fable than any other tragedy. Hence, such songs are nothing more than choral interludes, a practice that Agathon introduced for the first time. But what real difference is there between the singing of such interpolated songs and attempting to adapt a speech or even a complete act from one drama to another? Chapter 19. After discussing the fable and the characters, it remains to consider diction and thought. Regarding thought, we can assume what has been said about it in our treatise on rhetoric, for it belongs more to that sector of investigation. Thought includes all the effects that must be produced by means of language. Among these are proof or refutation, the excitation of emotion, pity, fear, anger, and so forth, or the increasing or decreasing of the significance of the facts. It is also clear that in the action of the drama, the same principles must be observed, whether it is necessary to produce effects of pity or terror, or of grandeur or probability. The only difference is that with the act the impression must be provoked without explanation, while with the spoken word it has to be produced by the speaker and results from their language. What, consequently, would be the advantage of the speaker if everything appeared in the proper light outside of their intervention? Regarding diction, one subject of study consists of the various forms of expression. The understanding of these corresponds to the art of elocution and is necessary for scholars of that art. This includes the difference between command and prayer, simple affirmation and threat, question and answer, and so forth. Whether the poet knows these things or does not know them, their art as a poet is never seriously criticized on that account. What fault can be observed in Homer's verse, "Sing, O goddess, the wrath"? Protagoras censured this as a command, where a prayer is imposed, for to beg someone to do something or not to do it, he tells us, is a command. Let us set this aside, then, as belonging to another art, and not to that of poetry. Chapter 20. Diction, considered as a whole, is formed of the following parts: the letter, or ultimate element, the syllable, the conjunction, the article, the noun, the verb, the case, and the discourse. The letter is an indivisible sound of a particular kind, which can become a factor in an intelligible sound. Indivisible sounds are also emitted by animals, but none of these is a letter in our sense of the term. These elementary sounds are either vowels, semivowels, or mutes. A vowel is a letter that has an audible sound without the addition of another letter. A semivowel possesses an audible sound with the addition of another letter. For example, S and R. A mute is one that has no sound by itself but becomes audible when combined with letters that possess sound. Examples are G and D. Letters differ in sound according to the shape of the mouth and the places where they are produced, according to whether they are aspirated or unaspirated, or long, short, or of variable quantity, and furthermore, according to whether they have an acute, grave, or circumflex accent. The details of these problems we must leave to metrics. The syllable is a composite, non-significant sound, formed by a mute and a letter that has sound, a vowel or semivowel. Thus, gr without a is as much a syllable as gra with a. The diverse forms of the syllable also belong to metrical theory. A conjunction is a non-significant sound that, when forming a significant sound with another, neither impedes nor leads to the production of a single significant utterance from the combination of the diverse sounds, and which, if the discourse so integrated remains separate, must not be inserted at the beginning of it. For example, men, d, tui, d. Or, it is a non-significant sound capable of combining two or more significant sounds into one. For example, amphi, peri, and so forth. The article is a non-significant sound that marks the beginning, the end, or the division point of a discourse. and its natural place is either at the extremities or in the middle. The noun is a composite, significant sound that does not contain the idea of time, with parts that have no meaning by themselves within it. It must be remembered that in a compound, we do not think of the parts as having a meaning by themselves within it. In the name Theodore, for example, doron means nothing to us. The verb is a composite, significant sound that involves the idea of time, with parts that, as in the noun, have no meaning by themselves within it. While the word man, or white, does not imply when, walks and has walked enclose, besides the idea of walking, that of present or past time. The case of a noun or a verb indicates the relation of or to a thing, and so forth, or whether it refers to one or to many, for example, man or men. Or it may consist simply of the mode of expression, that is, question, command, and so forth. Was he walking? And walk are cases of the verb according to this distinction. The discourse is a composite, significant sound, some of whose parts have a certain meaning by themselves. Let us observe that a discourse is not always constituted by a noun and a verb. It can exist without a verb, such as the definition of man, but it will always have some fraction with its own meaning. In the phrase Cleon walks, Cleon is an example of such a part. A discourse is said to be one in two ways, either as signifying one thing, or as the union of diverse discourses made into one by an appropriate connection. Thus, the unity of the Iliad is won by the linking of its parts, and the definition of man is won by designating a single thing. Chapter 21. Nouns can be classified as simple, by which I mean those constituted by elements that individually have no meaning, like earth, or as double or compound. In this latter case, the word may be composed either of a significant or non-significant part, a distinction that disappears in the compound, or of two significant parts. There can also be triple, quadruple, and even larger names, as happens among the Massaliots, such as the word hermokaisaxanthus and others. Whatever its structure, a noun must always be the common word for a thing, a foreign word, a metaphor, a word of ornament, coined, lengthened, shortened, or altered in its form. By a common word, I mean one that is in general use in a region, and by a foreign word, I mean one that is employed in another people. Thus, the same word can obviously be both common and foreign, although not with reference to the same people. For example, sigenon, spear, is a common word in Cyprus and a foreign word to us. The metaphor consists in giving an object a name that belongs to some other. The transfer can be from genus to species, from species to genus, or from one species to another, or it can be a problem of analogy. As an example of transfer from genus to species, I say, "Here lies my ship," for lying at anchor is the permanence of one kind of thing. Transfer from species to genus we have in Odysseus has certainly performed 10,000 noble deeds, for 10,000, which is a very large number, is used here instead of the word many. The transfer from one species to another is seen in lopping off life with the bronze, or severing with the unyielding bronze. Here, to lop off is used in the sense of to sever, and to sever in place of to lop off, and both words mean to snatch, or to eliminate something. I explain the metaphor by analogy, as what can happen when of four things. The second stands in the same relation to the first as the fourth to the third. Then one can speak of the fourth instead of the second, and of the second instead of the fourth. And sometimes it is possible to add to the metaphor an appropriate qualification for the term that has been replaced. Thus, for example, a cup stands in relation to Dionysus as a shield stands in relation to Ares. Consequently, one can call the cup shield of Dionysus, and the shield cup of Ares. Or also, old age is to life as evening is to day, and thus designate the evening as the old age of the day. According to Empedocles' equivalent, old age is the evening or sunset of life. In some cases, there is no name for some of the terms of the analogy, but the metaphor can be used in the same way. For example, to throw seed is called sowing, but there is no word for the sun's scattering of its rays. However, this act stands in the same relation to sunlight as sowing does to grain, and hence the poet's expression, sowing around the God-created flame. There is also another way of employing metaphors. If the thing has been given a foreign name, one can, by a negative addition, deny it one of the attributes naturally associated with its new name. An example of this would be to call the shield not the cup of Ares, as in the previous case, but a cup that does not contain wine. A coined word is a name that, unknown to the people, is invented by the poet themselves. There are words of this kind, such as erinages for horns and areter for priest. A word is said to be lengthened when it has a short vowel that is modified or an extra syllable is inserted. For example, polios for poleos and peleniadiou for peleidou. A word is said to be shortened when it loses a part, like kri, do, and ops in mia ginetai amphoterun ops. A look is produced by both eyes. A word is altered when one part is left as it was, and another part is the poet's invention. Dexiteron used for dexion. In dexiteron kata maxon, over the right chest. The nouns themselves, to whatever class they belong, are masculine, feminine, or neuter. All those that end in any, n, rho, r, sigma, s, or in the two compounded from it, psi and she, are masculine. All those that end in the invariably long vowels eta and omega, and in alpha, are feminine. Thus, there is an equal number of masculine and feminine endings, because psi and psi are equivalent to sigma, s. There is, however, no noun in a mute or in any of the two short vowels, epsilon and omicron. Only three, meli, kami, peppery, honey, gum, pepper, and in iota, I, and five end in upsilon, u, neuter nouns and in the variable vowels or in ninatu, aro, r, and sigma, s. Chapter 22. The perfection of diction consists in being both clear without being prosaic. What is clearest, however, is that which is constituted by common words, but this becomes commonplace, as is observed in the poetry of Cleophon and Sthenelus. On the other hand, diction becomes distinguished and above the everyday level through the use of dignified terms, foreign words, metaphors, lengthened forms, and everything that deviates from the vulgar modes of discourse. Nevertheless, the exclusive use of such terms will result in either an enigma or a barbarism. An enigma if metaphors are abused, a barbarism if foreign words are appealed to. The very essence of the enigma is to express facts in an impossible combination of language. This result cannot be achieved through a simple succession of common terms, but it is possible through the use of metaphors, as in the enigma. I saw a man who with fire soldered bronze upon another man, and similar ones. In the same way, the use of exotic words leads to barbarism. What is needed, then, is a certain mixture of these diverse elements. Indeed, foreign words, metaphors, and ornamental terms will prevent the language from becoming vulgar and prosaic, while common words will ensure the required clarity. What helps most, however, to make the diction clear and not prosaic is the use of lengthened, shortened, and altered word forms. Their deviation from common words, by giving the language an accent distinct from general use, grants it a non-prosaic appearance, and inasmuch as it has much in common with words in current use, it gives it the condition of clarity. It is not correct, then, to condemn these modes of discourse and ridicule the poet for using them, as some have done. For example, Euclides the Elder, who affirmed that it would be easy to make poetry if it were allowed to lengthen words in the narration itself as desired, a procedure he caricatured by saying in vulgar Greek, "I saw Epicurus on his way to Marathon." A too manifest use of these licenses certainly has a ridiculous effect, but they are not unique to the case. The rule of moderation applies to all elements of poetic vocabulary. Even with metaphors, foreign words, and the rest, the result will be the same if it is all used improperly and with the purpose of provoking laughter. The correct use of these elements is something very different. To notice the difference, one must take an epic verse and observe how it sounds when normal words are introduced. The same must be done also with foreign words, metaphor, and the rest. For one must only put the common words in their place to verify the truth of what we say. The same iambic is found, for example, in Aeschylus and Euripides, and as it appears in the former it is a poor verse, while Euripides, with the change of a single word, the replacement of a foreign word, by what in use is the current word, makes it appear as beautiful. Aeschylus said in his Philoctetes, "The ulcer that eats the flesh of my foot." Euripides simply changed esthie, eats, to thoinatai, feasts on, or takes pleasure in. Or suppose for this other verse, "Now a despicable, repulsive, and insignificant rogue has blinded me," another change, "and now a weak, repulsive, and insignificant rogue." Or the line, "He placed for me an old seat and a rickety table," which could be, "He placed for me an old bench and a small table." Or, in Homer, to convert the shore bursts into the shore cries. Let us add to this that Ariphrades used to ridicule the tragedians for introducing expressions unknown in the language of daily life, such as "of the houses far" for "far from the houses," "sethen," "your," of you, "egu de nin," "I married her," and "axileos piri" instead of "piri axileos," about Achilles, and other expressions. The simple fact that those words are not used according to the current sense gives the diction a non-prosaic character. But Ariphrades did not understand this situation. It is, indeed, of high merit to employ these poetic forms correctly, as well as compounds and foreign words. However, the greatest skill consists in being a master of the metaphor. This is the only thing that cannot be learned from others, and it is also a sign of genius, since an excellent metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similar and the dissimilar. Of the classes of words we have enumerated, it can be observed that compound forms are more suitable for the dithyramb. Foreign words are better suited to heroic verse and metaphors to iambic poetry. All of them, however, can also be used appropriately in heroic verse. But in iambic verse, which as far as possible is modeled on spoken language, the only suitable terms are those employed in discourse, and these are words of current use, metaphors, and ornamental words. I need say no more about tragedy and the art of representation by means of action. In Chapter 23, regarding poetry that only narrates or imitates by means of versified language, without action, It's evident that it shares various points in common with tragedy. Construction of the epic fable. The construction of its fables must be as clear as that of a drama. They must be based on a single action, which must be a complete whole in itself, with a beginning, middle, and end, so that the work is capable of producing its own pleasure with all the organic unity of a living creature. It shouldn't be assumed that the epic must be constructed in the usual manner of our histories. A history deals not with a single action, but with a period and everything that happened within it to one or more individuals, no matter how disconnected the various events may have been. Just as two events may happen at the same time, for example, the naval battle at Salamis and the engagement with the Carthaginians in Sicily, without concurring in the same end, so too, in a determined sequence of time, two facts can follow one another without producing a single result. Nevertheless, it can be said that most of our epic poets ignore this distinction. The superiority of Homer, consequently, then, to repeat what we said before, we have further proof of the marvelous talent of Homer compared to the rest. He didn't attempt to deal with the Trojan War in its entirety, even though it was a whole with a defined beginning and end, for he undoubtedly realized that it was a story too extensive to be covered as a whole, or too complicated by the variety of its incidents. Thus, he selected a part of the whole. Many of the other incidents, however, he introduced as episodes, such as the catalogue of the ships and others, to vary the uniformity of his narration. As for the other epic poets, they treat of a single person or period, or even of one action which, though single, possesses a multiplicity of parts within it. The authors of the Cypria and the Little Iliad did the latter, and the result is that while the Iliad or the Odyssey provide material for a single tragedy, or at most two, the Cypria has served for several, and the Little Iliad for more than 8. The Judgment of the Arms. Philoctetes, Neoptolemus, Eurypylus, Odysseus the Beggar, the Lacedaemonian Women, the Fall of Troy, the Departure of the Fleet, Sinon, and the Trojan Women. Chapter 24. Furthermore, epic poetry must be divided into the same types as tragedy. It must be simple or complex, a story of character or of suffering. Its parts, too, with the exception of the song and the spectacle, must be the same, for it requires peripetia, recognitions, and scenes of suffering, just like tragedy. Lastly, the thought and diction must be of the required standard. All these elements appear first in Homer, and he made correct use of them. His 2 poems are each examples of construction. The Iliad is simple and a pathetic story, while the Odyssey is complex. There is recognition throughout it, and a story of character. And they are more than this, since in diction and thought they also surpass all other poems. Differences in epic, extent, and meter. There is, of course, a difference in the epic compared with tragedy, in its extent and in its meter. Regarding extent, the limit already suggested must suffice. It must be possible for the beginning and the end of the work to be grasped as a whole. This condition will be met if the poem is briefer than the old epic but limited to the extent of the group of tragedies offered for a single performance. In terms of its extent, the epic has a special advantage. In tragedy, it is not possible to represent various passages of the story simultaneously. The spectator is limited to the part that the actors develop on stage. Whereas in the epic, the narrative form makes it possible to describe a number of simultaneous incidents, and these, if they are related to the subject, increase the poem's interest. This is certainly an advantage for the epic, as it tends to give it grandeur and also variety of attraction and scope for episodes of different kinds. The monotony of incidents, due to the tedium it creates, causes the ruin of tragedies on stage. Regarding the meter, experience has shown that the heroic hexameter is the most suitable. If anyone dared to write a narrative poem in other meters, or in a variety of them, the inconsistency would be manifest. Of all the meters, the heroic hexameter is the most serious and elevated, since it makes possible better than others the admission of foreign words and metaphors, which is also an aspect in which the narrative form of poetry goes beyond all others. The iambic and the trochaic, on the other hand, are meters of movement. The former represents life or action, the other the dance. Nevertheless, it would be even less natural if one tried to write an epic by mixing meters, as Chaeremon did. Hence, until now, no one has written a large-scale poem except in heroic verse. Nature itself, as we have said, teaches us to select the appropriate meter for such a story. Homer's mastery of imitation and the improbable. Admirable as Homer is in many other respects, he is particularly so in this. He alone among epic poets knows the part the poet themselves should play in the poem. The poet must speak very little in their own person, as they are not an imitator in this case. Other poets always appear in the foreground and say little as imitators, and this only sporadically. Homer, after a brief preface, introduces a man, a woman, or some character. No one lacks character in his work, but each with their distinctive nuances. The marvelous is certainly required in tragedy. The epic, however, provides more scope for the improbable, the main factor in the marvelous, because in it the characters are not visible. The scene of the pursuit of Hector would be ridiculous on stage. The Greeks would be standing still instead of chasing him, and Achilles would shake his head to restrain them. But in the poem, the absurdity is absent. The marvelous is, of course, a cause of pleasure, as can be deduced from the fact that we all recount a story with additions, in the belief that we offer a delight to many listeners. Homer, more than anyone else, has taught us all the art of forging lies in a suitable manner. I refer to the use of the paralogism or false reasoning. Thus, if one thing exists because another exists, or happens because that other happens, it is thought that if the consequent exists, the antecedent would also exist. But this is not the case. Precisely because we know the truth of the consequent, we are led in our minds to the erroneous inference of the truth of the antecedent. There is an example regarding the story of the bath in the Odyssey. An improbable probability is preferable to an improbable possibility. Fables should not be constituted by irrational incidents. Everything irrational must be excluded as far as possible, or, if not, at least kept outside the narrative. Such is the hero's ignorance in Oedipus about how Laius died. It must not be admitted within the drama, such as the report of the Pythian games in Electra, or the character who came to Mysia from Tegea, who does not whisper a word in the Mysians. So, it would be ridiculous to say that a fable would be destroyed without these incidents, since it is fundamentally wrong to compose such fables. If the poet has adopted a fable, consequently, and it is realized that they could have composed it more rationally, they are guilty of absurdity as well as lack of art. Even in the Odyssey, the irrational elements in the episode of Odysseus's landing in Ithaca would certainly not have been accepted if they had been treated by an inferior poet. However, the poet concealed them, and his other excellences veiled such absurdity. Furthermore, elaborate diction is required only in places where there is no action, character, or thought to be revealed. Where, in addition, there is character or thought, an overly ornate diction tends to obscure them. Chapter 25. Regarding problems and their solutions, we must observe the number and nature of the assumptions from which they proceed by examining the question in the following way. The poet, being an imitator, just like a painter or other artisan of appearances, must in all instances necessarily represent things in one of these three aspects, either as they were or are, as they are said or thought to be or appear to have been, or as they ought to be. The poet does all this through language, perhaps with a mixture of foreign words and metaphors, as well as various modified forms of words, since their use is accepted in poetry. It must also be remembered that the same kind of accuracy is not found in poetry as in politics, or even in any other art. There is, however, within the limits of poetry itself, the possibility of two types of errors, one directly related to the art, the other only accidentally. If the poet intends to describe the thing justly and fails due to a lack of expressive power, their art itself is defective. But if their error lies in trying to describe something incorrectly, to make the horse, for example, advance both right legs at once, such a technical failure, say, in medicine or some other special science, or if they have let slip inconsistencies of any kind in their description, their error in such a case does not lie in the essence of the poetic art. Consequently, these must be the premises of the solutions in response to the criticisms involved in the problems. Criticisms related to the art. Itself regarding criticisms that refer to the poet's art itself, we will add the following. All impossibilities that exist in their description of things are false, but from another point of view, they are justifiable if they serve the end of poetry itself. That is, if such impossibilities make that same part of the work or any other result more captivating. The pursuit of Hector is a fitting example. If the poetic end could have been achieved as well or better without sacrificing the technical requirements in such matters, the impossibility is not justified, since the description must be, if possible, completely free of error. One may also ask if the error occurs in a problem directly or only accidentally related to the poetic art, because it is a minor transgression in an artist to not know, for example, that the doe has no horns, than to produce an unrecognizable imitation. Criticisms of correspondence to the object. If the poet's description is criticized for not corresponding to the object, one can respond that that object should perhaps be as it has been described, a response similar to that of Sophocles, who said he painted men as they ought to be, and Euripides as they were. If the description, however, is neither true nor of the thing as it should be, the answer must then be that it is in accordance with opinion. The accounts of the gods, for example, may be as erroneous as Xenophanes thinks, neither true nor something better. They are certainly in accordance with accepted opinion. Regarding other statements about poetry, one can perhaps affirm, not that they are better than the truth, but in accordance with custom. Thus, the description of the arms, their spears were placed upright, leaning on their base, for this was the habit of placing them among the Illyrians. Regarding the question of whether something said or done in a poem is morally correct or not, in treating it, one must consider not only the intrinsic quality of the actual word or event, but also the person who said or did it, the person to whom it was said or done, the time, the means and the motive of the author. Furthermore, if they did it to achieve a greater good or to avoid a serious evil. 3. Criticisms. Regarding language. Other criticisms can be addressed by examining the language of the poet. By the use of a foreign word where Homer with Oreus might mean sentinels and not mules, and in expressing that Dolon was of bad shape, his meaning may refer to his face being ugly, but not his body deformed, since euaides, well-formed, is a Cretan word that for us means euprosopon, beautiful face. Thus also, more energetically they mix the wine. As for drunkards, may mean more quickly they mix, or perhaps serve, the wine. Other expressions of Homer are perhaps explained metaphorically. For example, in "Then all the other gods and men slept through the night, if we compare it with," and certainly when he watched the Trojan plain and heard the sound of flutes and pipes and the noise of men. The word apantes. All is used metaphorically for many, poloi, since all is a kind of many. Thus also, alone without a part has a metaphorical meaning, for what is well known remains alone. A change in the way of reading a word, as Hippias of Thessos suggested, can resolve a difficulty, as in "we grant it," and part of which rots in the rain, instead of "does not rot in the rain." Other difficulties can be resolved through punctuation, as in Empedocles, and quickly those things that had previously experienced immortality became mortal, and those that had previously been pure were now mixed. Or through ambiguity, as in Homer, and the night has advanced more than 2/3, but a third remains. Sometimes it's a matter of language habits, such as wine mixed with water, which is simply called wine. And according to the same principle, Homer speaks of a newly forged tin greave. An ironworker is called a bronzesmith, and it is also said, according to this habit, that Ganymede pours wine for Zeus, although the gods do not drink wine. This can also be a metaphorical example. Therefore, whenever a word seems to imply a contradiction, it is necessary to reflect on how many ways of understanding it there may be in the passage in question. Thus, in Homer, the phrase, "there the bronze spear stopped," one must consider it according to the possible meanings of "there it stopped." By interpreting it in one nuance or another, one will better avoid the fault that Glaucon speaks of. They, the critics, begin by an improbable assumption, and then, after accepting it, proceed to draw inferences and censure the poet as if they had truly said what the critics attribute to them, when the poet's statement contradicts the critic's conclusions. In this way, Homer's silence about Icarius has been treated. Some critics hold that he was Spartan and therefore believe it is strange that Telemachus had not visited him on the occasion of his arrival in Sparta. Perhaps the fact is, as the Cephalonians relate, according to which Odysseus's wife belonged to a Cephalonian family, and the woman's father was named Icadius, not Icarius. It is probable that a critic's error gave rise to the problem. If we speak generally, then the impossible must be justified for the sake of a poetic requirement, or an attempt to embellish reality, or to accept traditional opinion. In terms of poetic effect, a convincing impossibility is preferable to an unacceptable possibility, although it may be impossible for men like those Zeuxis used to paint to exist. It would nevertheless be admirable if they did, for the artist must improve the model. The improbable must be justified by showing either that it is in accordance with tradition or by accepting that it is sometimes improbable. For there is a probability that some things also happen against probability. The contradictions found in the poet's language must be examined first, just as one does with the opponent's refutations in a dialectical argument, to check if the opponent means the same thing, in the same relation and in the same sense, before admitting that they have contradicted something they themselves affirmed, or what a man of sound judgment would accept as true. However, there is no possible excuse for the improbability of the fable or the depravity of the character when these elements are not necessary and are not used properly, as happens with the improbability of Aegeus's appearance in Medea, or the meanness of Menelaus in Orestes. The critic's objections, consequently, begin with 5 classes of faults. The cause is always that something is impossible, improbable, immoral, contradictory, or against technical accuracy. The answers to these objections must be sought in one or another of the aforementioned criteria, which are 12. Chapter 26. The question may be raised whether the epic or tragedy is the highest form of imitation. One might argue that if the less vulgar form is the worthier, and the less vulgar is always that which addresses the most demanding audience, an art intended for everyone is of a very inferior order. It's a deeply rooted belief that the audience can't understand the meaning if something isn't added to provoke the actor's constant movement. For example, bad flute players roll on the floor if the discus throw is being represented, and they drag the chorus leader with them if they are representing Scylla. Tragedy, then, is claimed to be an art of this sort. It corresponds to what the old actors thought of their successors. Thus, Meniscus called Callipides the ape, because he overacted his parts, and the same reputation was assigned to Pindarus. Consequently, all tragedy stands in the same relation to the epic as the most recent actors stand to the earlier ones. The epic, it is asserted, is addressed to a cultivated audience that doesn't need the accompaniment of gestures, the other to an audience lacking taste. If, therefore, tragedy is a vulgar art, it's clear that it must be inferior to the epic. The answer to this question is twofold. 1. The reproach is about performance. Not the art firstly, it can be asserted that the reproach does not affect the art of the dramatic poet, but only that of the actors. For it is undoubtedly possible also to exaggerate the gestures in the epic recitation, as Sosistratus did, and in singing Mnesithius of Opus. However, one should not censure every kind of gesticulation, unless one condemns dance in passing, but only that of inferior people, which is the criticism made against Callipides, and currently against others who imitate low-status women. Furthermore, tragedy can achieve its effects even without movement or action, in the same way as epic poetry, for its quality can be judged by simply reading it. So, if tragedy is in other respects the highest of the arts, this disadvantage is not necessarily inherent in it. 2. Tragedy's superiority in scope and unity. Secondly, we must remember that tragedy has everything the epic possesses, since it admits the same meter, and, which is no small addition, it can employ music and scenic effects which are a source of genuine pleasure. And this representative element is experienced in a drama both when it is read and when it is performed. Moreover, tragic imitation requires less space for the achievement of its end, which is a great advantage, since what is more concentrated produces greater pleasure than what is extended over a long period of time. Consider, for example, Sophocles' Oedipus, and the result it would produce if it were lengthened to as many verses as the Iliad. Likewise, there is less unity in the imitation of epic poets, which is proven by the fact that any of their works provides material for several tragedies. As a result, if these poets deal with a single fable, it would appear truncated if it were briefly represented, or would give the impression of having been diluted if the usual length of such poems were observed. When I state that there is less unity in the epic, I refer to an epic composed of a plurality of actions, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which have many parts, each of a certain magnitude. And yet these poems are constructed as perfectly as possible, and each one, insofar as it has been possible, is the representation of a single action. Consequently, tragedy is superior in these aspects, and also, in addition to these, in its poetic effect, since both forms of poetry must give us not one or any kind of pleasure, but that special kind of pleasure we have mentioned. It is evident that by achieving the poetic effect better than the epic, tragedy must be the highest form of the art. This is all I had to say about tragedy and epic poetry, whether in general terms or in relation to their diverse forms and constitutive parts. about the number and characteristics of these parts, regarding the success or failure of the two arts, and the various critical problems and their solutions. Thank you for listening to this audiobook until the end. If you enjoyed the content, we invite you to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss our upcoming publications.